I've always been good at being invisible. Standing at the back of that glittering Palm Beach ballroom, watching chandeliers cast golden light across polished marble floors, I perfected the art of disappearing while remaining physically present. The crowd of 300 guests, business associates, socialites, and Harvard alumni, buzzed with anticipation as my father, Samuel Wexler, stepped onto the stage. "Today," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers with practiced authority, "is not just about celebrating Julian's graduation from Harvard Business School with highest honors." He paused for the obligatory applause. "It's about the future of the Wexler legacy." My brother Julian stood beside him, tall and polished in his custom Armani suit, flashing that perfect smile that had graced countless society pages. At 32, he embodied everything our parents had ever wanted: brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious. Everything I was not. I shifted uncomfortably in my off-the-rack suit, feeling the weight of absence more than presence. No one had saved me a seat at the family table. No one had even noticed I'd arrived. At 28, I was still the other Wexler. Boy. The disappointment, the afterthought, the shadow. Julian, my father continued, placing his hand on my brother's shoulder, has proven himself worthy of carrying our family's name forward, which is why today I am officially announcing his succession as CEO of Wexler Industries, effective immediately. The crowd erupted into applause. My mother, Vivian, dabbed at non-existent tears with a silk handkerchief. Additionally, my father raised his voice over the cheers. To ensure he represents our family with appropriate dignity, I am gifting him our Manhattan townhouse, and he gestured toward the window where a brand new Tesla Model S gleamed in the afternoon sun, something to get him there in style. More applause, more photographs, more validation for the golden child. I remained still, letting the familiar ache of exclusion wash over me. This wasn't new. This was just another Thursday in the Wexler family, albeit with better lighting and catering. From my earliest memories, the hierarchy had been clear. Julian at the top, bathed in constant praise, me at the bottom, collecting criticism like others collect baseball cards. "Try harder, Caleb," my father would say, even when I brought home straight A's. "Why can't you be more like Julian?" My mother would sigh when I chose books over basketball. By 12, I'd learned that nothing I did would ever be enough. By 16, I'd stopped trying to be seen. By 21, I'd accepted my role as family furniture. Present, but irrelevant, taking up space without purpose. I was considering slipping out early. No one would notice anyway. When I felt a light tap on my shoulder, I turned to find an unfamiliar man in a charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Caleb Wexler?" he asked quietly. I nodded, surprised to be recognized. "Thomas Henderson," he said, extending his hand. "Your grandfather's attorney." I shook it, confusion replacing my usual numbness. "My grandfather passed away 3 years ago." I'm well aware. A hint of something, disapproval, sadness, crossed his face. I've been waiting for this specific moment to fulfill his final instructions. Before I could ask what he meant, Henderson slipped a sealed envelope into my hands. Heavy cream-colored paper, embossed with my grandfather's initials, M.W., Martin Wexler. "What is this?" I whispered. "The truth," Henderson said simply. "Your grandfather asked me to deliver this today, specifically after your father made his big announcement." I stared at the envelope. My grandfather had been the only person who ever saw me, who asked about my dreams instead of my grades, who told me I had value even when everyone else treated me like a mistake. "Open it," Henderson urged, his voice gentle but firm. "It's time." My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a folded document bearing the official letterhead of Henderson and Associates, alongside a smaller handwritten note. The note read, "Caleb, my boy, if you're reading this, then they've continued to underestimate you, just as I feared they would. It's time to show them who you really are. With love and faith, Grandpa Martin." I looked up at Henderson, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. "What does this mean?" "It means," Henderson said, taking the larger document from my hands and stepping toward the stage, "that we have an announcement to make." My father was in the middle of a toast, champagne flute raised high, when Henderson approached the microphone. Confusion flickered across my father's face, quickly, replaced by irritation at the interruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson said, his authoritative voice cutting through the chatter, I apologize for the interruption, but I have a legal matter that must be addressed immediately. The room quieted, curiosity rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. My name is Thomas Henderson, senior partner at Henderson and Associates, and the executor of Martin Wexler's estate. My father stepped forward. This is hardly the time or place. On the contrary, Henderson continued smoothly, Mr. Martin Wexler specifically instructed that his final will and testament be read publicly at this exact occasion. A murmur spread through the crowd. My father's face darkened. Julian's perfect smile faltered. What are you talking about? My father demanded. My father's will was executed years ago. Henderson smiled thinly. The will you're referring to was preliminary. Martin filed an updated version with my firm 1 week before his death, a version he kept private until today. My mother gripped my father's arm. Julian's confident posture stiffened. This changes everything, Henderson said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. And suddenly, 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me, standing alone at the back of the ballroom. The invisible sun, finally seen. The silence in that ballroom felt electric, charged with 3 decades of family history suddenly threatening to rewrite itself. I stood frozen, feeling the weight of every stare as Henderson unfolded the document with deliberate care. Before I begin, he announced, I'd like to read a personal message from Martin Wexler, addressed to his family and guests. My father started to protest, but Henderson continued as if he hadn't heard. To my son Samuel, his wife Vivian, and everyone gathered today. If this letter is being read, it means you are celebrating Julian's achievements while once again relegating Caleb to the shadows. This pattern stops today. I built Wexler Industries from nothing, not for it to become a trophy for the favored child, but a legacy of values I fear have been forgotten. My mother gasped audibly. Julian's face flushed red. I remained motionless, my grandfather's words washing over me like rain after a drought. I have watched silently for years as one grandson was elevated and the other diminished. I have seen Caleb's quiet strength, his resilience, his depth of character, qualities that cannot be measured by trophies or transcripts. These are the qualities on which I built our family's success, not the hollow accolades Samuel has come to worship. I could see my father's jaw clenching, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, witnesses to our family's private dysfunction laid publicly bare. Henderson cleared his throat and continued reading the legal portion of the will. I, Martin Wexler, being of sound mind, hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments. To my son Samuel, I leave 10% shares in Wexler Industries, with the provision that he remains in an advisory capacity only. My father's face drained of color. To my grandson Julian, I leave my collection of first edition books and 10% shares in Wexler Industries. Julian's expression shifted from shock to outrage. The golden child was not accustomed to receiving scraps from the table. The remaining 80% controlling interest in Wexler Industries, my Manhattan residence, all associated properties, and the remainder of my financial assets, I bequeath to my grandson, Caleb Wexler. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scraping of chairs as people turned to locate me in the crowd. My father's thunderous, "This is impossible," pierced through the chaos, but I barely heard any of it. I was transported back to my grandfather's study, the warm leather chairs, the smell of his pipe tobacco, his weathered hands resting on mine as he said, "Caleb, they're looking at the wrong things. They can't see past the surface. But I see you, boy. I see what you'll become." Henderson raised his hand for silence. Additionally, he continued, Martin Wexler left specific instructions that Caleb is to assume immediate control of the company, with a board seat reserved for Mr. Henderson to ensure a smooth transition. My father stormed across the room, his face contorted with rage. "This is a fraud. My father would never—" "Your father's signature has been verified by 3 independent experts," Henderson interrupted calmly. "The will has been properly notarized and filed with the state. I assure you, Samuel, this document is legally binding and incontestable." As if on cue, 2 additional attorneys stepped forward, presenting copies of supporting documentation. My father turned to me then, really seeing me for perhaps the first time in years. "You," he spat. "You somehow manipulated him, got into his head when he was vulnerable." I finally found my voice. "I knew nothing about this." "Bullshit," Julian joined in, his perfect Harvard diction slipping. "You always were his favorite, following him around like a pathetic shadow." The words stung, but not because they were cruel, because they revealed how little my own brother understood about my relationship with our grandfather. Those quiet afternoons in Martin's study hadn't been about inheritance or manipulation. They'd been about the only genuine connection I'd ever felt with any family member. Henderson stepped between us. Mr. Wexler left video testimony explaining his decision. I have copies for the court and family members, should you wish to contest. My mother approached then, her social mask firmly in place despite the public unraveling of her family narrative. Surely we can discuss this privately, she said, her voice honey-coated, but eyes flashing warning. Actually, Mrs. Wexler, Henderson replied, your father-in-law specifically requested a public reading to ensure transparency. He was concerned about potential interference. The implication hung in the air. My grandfather had anticipated exactly this reaction, had known his son and grandson would try to bury his true wishes. As the reality sank in, Julian laughed bitterly. So, the company, the house, everything just goes to him? Caleb, who's never worked a day at Wexler Industries? Who couldn't even get into an Ivy League? What Julian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been rejected from Harvard not because I couldn't get in, but because I'd deliberately sabotaged my application. At 18, I'd already understood that following Julian there would mean 4 more years of comparisons I could never win. Instead, I'd attended state university, worked part-time jobs that my parents deemed beneath our family status, and built a life they never bothered to learn about. I'd found freedom in their indifference, constructing an identity beyond the narrow confines of the Wexler name. The crowd had begun to disperse. The celebration effectively ended. Business associates whispered among themselves, recalculating alliances. Friends of my parents made awkward excuses to leave. Julian's Harvard colleagues clustered around him, offering support that looked more like morbid fascination. Henderson placed a hand on my shoulder. There's more to discuss, but perhaps somewhere more private. Your grandfather left specific instructions about the transition. I nodded, still unable to fully process what was happening. As we moved toward the exit, I passed the table that had been reserved for family, the table where there had never been a place for me. On it sat the crystal champagne flutes, the elaborate flower arrangements, the congratulatory cards for Julian, and beside them, the keys to the Tesla my father had gifted him minutes earlier. Keys that, according to my grandfather's will, now belonged to me. I left them where they lay. Some victories aren't about claiming prizes. They're about finally being seen. The days following the Palm Beach revelation passed in a surreal blur. I moved through them like a ghost haunting my own life, surrounded by lawyers, documents, and the sudden, uncomfortable weight of inheritance. Henderson had set up a temporary office in my small apartment, a decision that visibly pained him as he placed his briefcase on my second-hand coffee table. The contrast between my modest living space and the opulent Wexler lifestyle I'd just inherited wasn't lost on either of us. Your grandfather anticipated resistance, Henderson explained on our 3rd day of meetings. He kept this version of the will completely confidential. Even I didn't know the full contents until he passed. Rain pattered against my windows as I sifted through decades of company records. My apartment, a 1-bedroom walk-up in a middle-class neighborhood of Miami, felt increasingly cramped with the growing piles of Wexler Industries documentation. Why? I asked, the question that had been echoing in my head since the ballroom. Why me and not Julian? Everyone always believed Julian was the perfect heir. Henderson removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. Martin came to see something in Julian that troubled him deeply, and something in you that gave him hope. He replaced his glasses. But those are his reasons to share, not mine. A knock at the door interrupted us. Sharp, demanding, unmistakably my father. When I opened it, Samuel Wexler stood in my hallway looking simultaneously out of place and imposing. His tailored suit was impeccable despite the rain, his silver hair perfectly styled, but his eyes were bloodshot, his face haggard with fury and sleeplessness. We need to talk, he said, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation. He stopped short at the sight of Henderson and the papers covering every surface. Already plotting how to dismantle everything I've built, I see. Your father built Wexler Industries, Samuel, Henderson corrected mildly. You expanded it. My father's jaw tightened. 30 years I've dedicated to that company. 30 years of sacrifices you can't begin to comprehend, Caleb. There it was, the familiar tone that had defined our relationship since childhood. The implication that I was too simple, too weak, too useless to understand the complexities of his world. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked quietly. "I want to understand what game you're playing." He paced the small living room, examining my humble surroundings with thinly veiled disgust. "Did you manipulate my father? Convince him I was mismanaging his company? Feed him lies about Julian?" "I didn't know anything about the will," I repeated, fatigue seeping into my voice. "I was as surprised as you were." "Bullshit." He slammed his hand against my bookshelf, sending several volumes tumbling to the floor. "My father would never have done this without outside influence. You must have gotten to him somehow." Henderson stood. "Mr. Wexler, I've known your father for 40 years. He was of completely sound mind when he made these changes. And if you're suggesting undue influence, I should remind you that such accusations have serious legal implications." My father's attention shifted to Henderson, his expression calculating. "How much?" he asked coldly. "How much is he paying you for this little performance?" "Whatever it is, I'll double it." The casual corruption of the offer, the assumption that everything and everyone had a price, revealed more about my father than perhaps he realized. "I'm not for sale," Henderson replied, his voice like steel. "Neither was your father's affection, though you never seemed to grasp that." My father turned back to me, changing tactics. "You don't want this, Caleb. You're not equipped for it. The responsibilities, the pressure, it'll crush you. You've never had the temperament for business." For the first time, I heard the desperation beneath his anger. He truly believed I would fail, not because he wanted me to, but because he couldn't imagine any other outcome. In his mind, I had always been, would always be, inadequate. "Maybe," I acknowledged, but Grandpa thought differently. My father was a sentimental old fool toward the end. He snapped. He lost perspective. "No," I said, the words stronger than I'd intended. "He gained it." My father stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. The silent, acquiescent son he'd dismissed for years was standing his ground, holding his gaze without flinching. "We can fight this in court," he warned. "It could take years. The company will suffer." "Is that what you want?" I asked. "To damage the company out of spite?" "I want what's rightfully Julian's. According to Grandpa's legally binding will, this is rightfully mine." I gestured to the documents surrounding us. "I'm just trying to understand why." My father's composure finally cracked. "Because he wanted to punish me," he shouted. "This isn't about you or Julian. It's his final power play against me, using you as his pawn." The accusation hung in the air between us. I considered it, turning it over, like a strange artifact. Was that all I was? A convenient weapon in some posthumous battle between father and son? No. My grandfather had seen me, really seen me, when no one else bothered to look. "I think you're wrong," I said softly. "I think this is exactly about Julian and me. About who we are, not just what we've achieved." My father laughed bitterly. "And what exactly have you achieved? Caleb? A mediocre degree? This?" He gestured dismissively at my apartment. "Pathetic excuse for independence? What could my father possibly have seen in you that would warrant this level of trust?" The question wasn't new. I'd asked it of myself every night since the ballroom revelation. What had Martin Wexler seen in his quiet, overlooked grandson? What potential had he recognized that even I couldn't fully articulate? "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I intend to find out." My father stared at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from contempt to something more complex. Frustration, confusion, perhaps the faintest trace of curiosity. "Julian will never accept this," he said finally. "Neither will your mother. I don't expect them to. The board respects me, not you. They'll resist this transition at every turn." "Probably," I agreed. My calm acceptance seemed to infuriate him more than argument would have. He was accustomed to opposition he could bulldoze, not quiet resolution he couldn't bend. "You're making a mistake," he said, moving toward the door. "This isn't a game for amateurs, Caleb. When you inevitably fail, don't expect me to pick up the pieces." After he left, Henderson and I sat in silence, listening to the rain intensify outside. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a storm gathering strength. "Your father will file legal challenges," Henderson said eventually. "They won't succeed, but they'll be disruptive. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around my small apartment, at the life I'd built independent of the Wexler name and fortune. It wasn't much by their standards, but it was mine, earned through work they'd never valued, choices they'd never respected. "I don't know if I'm prepared," I said honestly. But I know I'm not backing down. Henderson nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. Your grandfather said you'd say that. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew an aged leather journal. He also said it was time you read this. The journal's cover was worn smooth with handling, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, the first page bore a single sentence. The true measure of a man isn't what he inherits, but what he builds with his own hands. I felt something shift inside me. Determination replacing doubt, purpose eclipsing confusion. Whatever Martin Wexler had seen in me, I would find it. Whatever he had entrusted to me, I would honor. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows like nature itself was trying to break through. But inside, for the first time since the ballroom revelation, I felt strangely, unexpectedly calm. The Wexler Industries headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Miami, 52. Stories of glass and steel rising above Biscayne Bay. I'd visited only a handful of times in my life, always as an afterthought, always trailing behind Julian during school holidays or company events. Now, exactly 1 week after the ballroom revelation, I walked through the imposing lobby alone, the weight of my grandfather's journal in my messenger bag. The security guard did a double take as I approached the executive elevator. Mr. Wexler? He asked uncertainly, clearly accustomed to stopping me rather than welcoming me. Good morning, Eddie, I replied, reading his nameplate. His surprise at being addressed by name was evident. I'm heading up to the executive floor. Yes, sir, of course. He fumbled with his security panel. Mr. Henderson called down about you. I just didn't, recognize me as a Wexler? I finished for him, smiling slightly. I get that a lot. The executive elevator ascended with expensive smoothness, its mirrored walls reflecting a version of myself I hardly recognized. Dressed in a suit Henderson had insisted on, hair neatly trimmed, shoulders squared with manufactured confidence. The doors opened directly into a reception area where a stylish woman, in her 50s, looked up from her desk, her professional smile faltering when she saw me. Caleb, she said, recovering quickly. We weren't expecting you until 9. I wanted to get an early start, Ms. Patricia, she supplied. Patricia Donnelly. I've been your father's executive assistant for 15 years. The unspoken loyalty in those words was clear. She was my father's person, not mine. I would face many such invisible barriers in the days ahead. It's nice to finally meet you properly, Patricia. Is the main conference room available? Mr. Henderson will be joining me shortly for the board meeting. The board meeting isn't until 11, she corrected, consulting her tablet. I called an emergency session for 8:30, I explained. Henderson sent the notifications. Yesterday. Patricia's composed expression cracked slightly. I wasn't informed. That's concerning, I said mildly. As executive assistant, you should be copied on all board communications. We'll need to address that oversight. Before she could respond, the elevator chimed again. Henderson emerged, followed by 2 younger associates carrying leather portfolios. Good morning, Mr. Wexler, he said formally, setting the professional tone. The board members have been arriving. Most are already in the conference room. I nodded, suppressing my nervousness. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Let's not keep them waiting. Walking down the corridor toward the conference room felt surreal, like stepping into a recurring childhood dream where I finally had a voice. The portraits of past company. Leaders lined the walls. My great-grandfather, stern and formidable. My grandfather, dignified yet warm. And my father, whose portrait had been commissioned prematurely, his eyes following me with painted disapproval. The massive mahogany doors of the conference room opened to reveal 11 people seated around an equally massive table, their conversations stopping abruptly as I entered. At the far end sat my father with Julian beside him. Gentlemen, ladies, Henderson announced. May I present Caleb Wexler, majority shareholder and new chief executive of Wexler Industries, as stipulated by the legally executed will of Martin Wexler. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. I moved to the head of the table, my grandfather's former seat, my father's current one. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he remained seated to my right, visibly seething. Thank you all for accommodating this early meeting, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. I recognize this transition is unexpected for everyone, myself included. A silver-haired man halfway down the table cleared his throat. With all due respect, Mr. Wexler, the younger Mr. Wexler, this situation is unprecedented. Many of us have concerns about the stability of leadership going forward. Julian smirked. Several board members nodded agreement. Your concerns are valid, Mr. Hargrove. Richard Hargrove. I've been on this board for 20 years. Mr. Hargrove, I acknowledged. I appreciate your candor. I'm not going to pretend I have the business experience my father or brother have. What I do have is majority ownership, a legal mandate from the company's founder, and a commitment to honoring his vision. Vision is wonderful, my father interjected, but this company requires experienced leadership, not sentimental platitudes. I turned to face him directly. I agree completely, Dad, which is why I've spent the past week reviewing the company's financial position, leadership structure, and strategic initiatives. Henderson? On cue, Henderson's associates distributed comprehensive portfolios to each board member. What you're receiving, I continued, is an analysis of Wexler Industries' current state, including several concerning patterns I've identified. My father's expression shifted from dismissive to wary as board members began flipping through the documents. Page 3 details a pattern of declining profit margins in our core manufacturing divisions, I said, masked by aggressive accounting practices that, while technically legal, paint an artificially rosy picture for shareholders. A murmur went around the table. Julian's smirk vanished. Page 7 outlines 3 major acquisition attempts in the past 5 years, all of which failed due to overvaluation and financing structures that expose the company to unnecessary risk. My father's face darkened. These are complex business decisions that have cost the company $43 million in failed merger expenses. I finished for him. Yes, they're complex. They're also demonstrably flawed, as the financial outcomes clearly show. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't made accusations, I'd simply presented facts. Facts I'd discovered in my grandfather's journal, where he'd documented his growing concerns about the company's direction under my father's leadership. The final section, I continued, outlines my proposed way forward. Not sweeping changes or dramatic restructuring, but a return to the core principles that made Wexler Industries successful under my grandfather: fiscal responsibility, strategic growth, and ethical leadership. For the next hour, I led the board through my analysis, not as an experienced CEO, but as someone who had done his homework, who respected their expertise while challenging their assumptions. Henderson provided legal and financial context where needed, but largely allowed me to stand on my own. By the time we concluded, the energy in the room had shifted. The open hostility had been replaced by cautious assessment. I wasn't winning hearts and minds yet, but I'd earned their attention, and perhaps a sliver of grudging respect. All except Julian, who had remained sullenly silent, and my father, whose anger had calcified into cold determination. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out with thoughtful expressions, several nodding to me with newfound consideration. My father remained seated, waiting until we were alone. Impressive performance, he said flatly. Did Henderson prepare those talking points for you? No, I replied. Grandpa did. I removed the journal from my bag and placed it on the table between us. He saw what was happening to his company, Dad. He was just waiting for the right moment to act. My father stared at the journal, recognition, and something like fear flashing across his face. This isn't over, Caleb, he said quietly. Not by a long shot. I knew he was right. This was just the opening move in what would likely be a long, painful game. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing by his rules. I know, I replied. But it started, and I'm not the person you think I am. The Wexler family estate sprawled across 3 manicured acres in Coral Gables, its Mediterranean revival architecture and wrought iron gates a testament to old Miami wealth. I hadn't visited in nearly 2 years, not since that disastrous Christmas when Julian had announced his engagement to Sophia Winters, daughter of a senator, Harvard law graduate, and the perfect addition to the perfect Wexler heirs. Perfect life. Now, as my Uber pulled up to the gates, I felt like an intruder despite the fact that, according to my grandfather's will, I technically owned a third of this property too. The intercom crackled when I pressed the button. Yes? My mother's voice, cool and distant even through the static. It's Caleb, Mom. A pause. Caleb. Not a question, not an exclamation, just a flat acknowledgement of my existence. Come up to the house. The gates swung open reluctantly, as if the estate itself was hesitant to admit me. I walked the curved driveway rather than waiting for someone to collect me in a golf cart, taking in the riot of bougainvillea and royal palms that flanked the path. My mother waited on the front steps, a tumbler of amber liquid in her manicured hand, despite the early hour. At 58, Vivian Wexler remained striking, tall and slender, her blonde hair artfully colored to disguise any gray, her face preserved through whatever combination of genetics, skincare, and subtle procedures kept Miami's elite looking perpetually 40. "I'm surprised you called ahead this time," she said by way of greeting. "No more dramatic entrances with lawyers in tow? I think we've had enough drama, don't you?" She sipped her drink, assessing me over the rim of her glass. "You look different." "New suit?" I offered, though we both knew that wasn't what she meant. "Come inside. Your brother's here." The grand foyer opened into the main living room, where Julian paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. He turned as we entered, his expression hardening. "What's he doing here?" he demanded of our mother. "Apparently we're having a family meeting," she replied, crossing to refresh her drink at the bar cart. "Samuel will be down shortly." I remained standing, unwilling to settle into the comfort of a home that had never truly felt like mine. "I came to talk about what happens next," Julian scoffed. "What happens next is we contest this absurd will, expose whatever manipulation you used on Grandpa, and restore the proper succession plan." "There will be no contest," my father announced, descending the curved staircase. Unlike my mother, he looked older than his 60 years. The past week had deepened the lines around his mouth, added shadows beneath his eyes. Henderson made that clear. "Martin's will is ironclad." Julian whirled to face him. "You can't be serious. You're just going to let him take everything you built? Everything I was promised?" "Everything Grandpa built," I corrected quietly. "And I didn't take it. It was given to me." "Oh, spare us the innocent act," Julian snapped. "We all know you were his favorite, following him around like a lost puppy, hanging on his every word while the rest of us were actually working." The accusation stung, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how little my own brother understood about my relationship with our grandfather. Those quiet afternoons hadn't been about inheritance or manipulation. They'd been about connection, about being seen for who I was rather than measured against who I wasn't. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to offer a compromise." My father's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of compromise?" "Julian stays on as COO. You remain as chairman emeritus with voting rights on major acquisitions. Mom keeps her social committee positions and charity board seats." I took a breath. All compensation packages remain unchanged. My family exchanged glances, clearly having expected a different approach. "And in return?" my father asked cautiously. "In return, you stop the whisper campaign with the board members. You stop trying to undermine my authority with the executive team. And you acknowledge, publicly, that this transition is legitimate and supported by the family." Julian laughed incredulously. "That's your big compromise? We pretend to support your hostile takeover while you play CEO until you inevitably run the company into the ground?" "It's not a hostile takeover, it's a legally executed succession plan," I replied evenly. "And I'm not playing at anything. I'm the controlling shareholder of Wexler Industries, whether you like it or not." "And if we refuse your generous offer?" my mother asked, swirling her drink. "Then I remove Julian from his position, revoke Dad's emeritus status, and eliminate the discretionary funding for your social committees." I held her gaze. "And I take possession of this house, which is part of the Wexler Industries property holdings, not your personal asset." The room went silent. My father's face flushed with anger, but there was something else there too, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. "When did you get teeth, little brother?" Julian finally said. "I've always had them. You were just too busy looking down on me to notice." My mother set her glass down with deliberate care. "You would really evict your own family? After everything we've done for you?" The question nearly made me laugh. What exactly did she think they had done for me, besides provide genetic material and basic necessities while systematically dismantling my self-worth? "I don't want to," I said honestly. "That's why I'm here, offering a way for us all to move forward. But make no mistake, I will protect Grandpa's legacy, even from his own family if necessary." My father studied me with narrowed eyes. "You've changed." "No," I corrected him. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You're just seeing me for the first time." He nodded slowly. Calculation. Replacing anger. "We need to discuss this privately." He gestured to my mother and Julian. "As a family." I understood I wasn't included in that category. I never had been. "You have until Monday," I said, moving toward the door. "After that, I move forward with or without your cooperation." As I reached the foyer, Julian called after me. "He wouldn't even recognize you now, you know. Grandpa, he thought you were this quiet, gentle soul." not someone who'd threaten his own family. I turned back. Grandpa knew exactly who I was, Julian. That's why he chose me. Outside, the Florida sun beat down mercilessly, reflecting off the polished marble of the front steps. I loosened my tie, feeling both drained and strangely invigorated by the confrontation. My phone buzzed with a text from Henderson. Board chair called. Wants to meet privately. Progress. Before I could respond, another message appeared. This one from an unknown number. You're asking the right questions. Not everyone at WI wants to maintain the status quo. Coffee? I stared at the cryptic message, wondering who within the company might be reaching out. An ally? A trap? The only certainty was that the battle lines were being drawn, and they weren't as clear-cut as my family wanted me to believe. As my Uber arrived, I cast one last glance at the house, the fortress of family mythology I'd never quite belonged in. For the first time, I didn't feel a pang of exclusion. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief that I'd built my identity beyond these walls, beyond the Wexler name and expectations. Whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, not as the shadow they'd tried to make me. The coffee shop in Wynwood didn't look like the kind of place where corporate conspiracies were hatched. Street art covered every available surface. 20-something baristas with sleeve tattoos crafted elaborate pour-overs, and the clientele seemed more interested in their laptops than corporate espionage. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the back exit, a paranoid precaution that felt necessary given the circumstances. I had no idea who I was meeting or what they wanted, only that they claimed to be an insider at Wexler Industries with information to share. At precisely noon, the door opened and a familiar face appeared, not one I'd expected. Patricia Donnelly, my father's executive assistant of 15 years, scanned the room with practiced efficiency before spotting me. She walked over with the confident stride of someone accustomed to navigating corporate corridors, a leather portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. "Mr. Wexler," she greeted me formally as she slid into the chair opposite mine. "Patricia," I replied, unable to hide my surprise. "You're my mysterious texter?" I apologize for the cloak and dagger approach. She set her portfolio on the table, keeping one hand resting protectively on it. But given the current climate at WI, discretion seemed advisable. A barista approached, and Patricia ordered an espresso without consulting the menu. The casual confidence of the gesture reminded me that this woman had been the gatekeeper to power at Wexler Industries for longer than I'd been an adult. She knew how the company worked, not just its organizational chart, but its hidden hierarchies and unspoken alliances. "I'm guessing you didn't ask me here to discuss my father's calendar," I said once the barista had left. A hint of a smile touched her lips. "No, though your father's calendar is actually quite relevant to what I need to tell you." She opened her portfolio and slid a document across the table, an email printout with several sections highlighted in yellow. "3 months ago, your father began a series of private meetings with Lawrence Chen of Meridian Capital," she explained. "They were kept off the official calendar, conducted either at restaurants or Mr. Chen's private residence." I scanned the document, a dinner reservation confirmation forwarded to my father's personal email rather than his work account. "Meridian Capital, they're the Singapore-based investment firm?" Patricia nodded. "With significant Chinese backing, yes. They've been attempting to expand their U.S. holdings for years." The implications slowly dawned on me. "You think my father is negotiating a sale? Without board approval?" "Not a sale," she corrected. "A merger that would effectively cede control of Wexler Industries' intellectual property and manufacturing capabilities to Meridian, while maintaining the appearance of American ownership." I sat back, stunned by the accusation. If true, that's potentially illegal. Certainly a breach of fiduciary duty. Which is why it was structured as a series of seemingly unrelated transactions. She produced more documents, financial projections, restructuring proposals, draft term sheets, all bearing my father's distinctive initials in the margins. The board would have approved each individual step without seeing the complete picture. "How did you get these?" I asked, leafing through the evidence of my father's apparent betrayal. Patricia's expression remained professionally neutral. "I've been your father's right hand for 15 years, Mr. Wexler. There's very little that crosses his desk that doesn't cross mine first. Why show me? Why not take this to the board yourself?" She considered me carefully before answering. "Because I respected your grandfather enormously. He built this company with integrity, and because I've watched you grow up on the periphery of your family's attention, underestimated, overlooked, but always observant. Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. You believe my grandfather chose correctly? I believe Martin Wexler rarely made mistakes when judging character, she replied diplomatically. The question is, what will you do with this information? It was a fair question, one I wasn't fully prepared to answer. Using these documents against my father would irrevocably fracture any hope of reconciliation. The family compromise I'd proposed earlier would be off the table. War would be declared, and it would be public, messy, and destructive. I need to verify this independently, I said finally. Of course. She reached into her bag and produced a small USB drive. Everything's here, including meeting recordings I shouldn't technically have. I stared at the innocent-looking device. Why Patricia? After 15 years of loyalty to my father, why turn on him now? Something flickered across her professional mask, a glimpse of genuine emotion quickly contained. I'm not loyal to Samuel Wexler. I'm loyal to Wexler Industries. There's a difference. Before I could probe further, her phone buzzed. She checked it and stood abruptly. Your father's meeting ended early. I need to get back. She gathered her portfolio, leaving the USB drive on the table. Whatever you decide, I would appreciate discretion regarding my involvement. Of course, I assured her. Thank you for taking this risk. She paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. You know, you look remarkably like your grandfather when he was young. Not just physically. There's something in your eyes. The same quiet determination. The observation caught me off guard. No one had ever compared me to Martin Wexler before. It had always been Julian who supposedly carried the family resemblance. Patricia straightened her jacket with a practiced gesture. One more thing, Mr. Wexler. The board meeting tomorrow, your father has been making calls. 6 of the 11 members have agreed to support Julian's motion to create a transition oversight committee, effectively limiting your authority while they search for ways to challenge the will. I assumed something like that was coming, I admitted. Any suggestions? The faintest smile touched her lips. Check your grandfather's journal, April 1997. With that cryptic advice, she left as efficiently as she'd arrived, leaving me with a USB drive full of potential corporate treason and an increasingly complicated chess match against my own family. I signaled for the check, my mind racing with implications and possibilities. If what Patricia had shared was accurate, my father wasn't just fighting to maintain family control of Wexler Industries. He was actively working to surrender that control to foreign investors while maintaining a lucrative position for himself. The question was whether I could prove it in time to counter Julian's move at tomorrow's board meeting, and whether I was prepared for the nuclear fallout that would follow if I did. As I paid and gathered my things, my phone buzzed with a text message. My mother. We've discussed your proposal. Dinner tonight at the house, 8 p.m. We have conditions. I stared at the message, wondering if they already knew about Patricia's visit, about the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. Were they moving forward in good faith or setting a trap? There was only one way to find out. But first I needed to check my grandfather's journal. April 1997. I spent the afternoon in my apartment with my grandfather's journal open to April 1997, the USB drive plugged into my laptop, and Henderson on speakerphone. The picture that emerged was more damning than I'd initially realized. This is serious, Henderson said, his voice grave after reviewing the documents Patricia had provided. If authentic, these communications constitute a clear breach of fiduciary duty, possibly securities fraud. They're authentic, I replied, staring at a scanned contract bearing my father's signature, a preliminary agreement with Meridian Capital that would have effectively surrendered Wexler Industries' proprietary manufacturing technology to foreign control. The question is, how do we use this? Carefully, Henderson cautioned. Accusations of this magnitude against your father could tank the company's stock value overnight. I turned another page in my grandfather's journal, my attention caught by a particular entry. April 15, 1997. Board bylaws amended today. Implemented emergency succession protocol as safeguard against hostile action. Samuel opposed it as unnecessary. One day he may understand why I insist on planning for all contingencies, even those that seem impossible. Henderson, I said slowly, what exactly are the emergency succession protocols in the board bylaws? I heard papers shuffling on his end. Section 11.3. In the event of actions contrary to company interests by any officer or director, the majority shareholder may invoke emergency powers to remove said individual immediately, subject to ratification by simple majority vote at next scheduled board meeting. The pieces clicked into place. And as controlling shareholder, I have that power. Yes, Henderson confirmed, though it's never been invoked in company history. It was designed as a nuclear option. I thought about the dinner invitation from my mother, the conditions they wanted to discuss, whatever trap they were setting. For tomorrow's board meeting, I now had a counterplay. But using it would permanently destroy any hope of reconciliation with my father and brother. I need to think, I told Henderson, and I need to prepare for this dinner tonight. After ending the call, I sat with the journal, running my fingers over my grandfather's handwriting. Each entry revealed a man I'd known intimately, yet not fully, understood. A visionary who built a company based on principles, who saw the long game, who recognized threats decades before they materialized, who had seen something in his quiet, overlooked grandson that no one else had bothered to look for. My phone buzzed with a text from Julian. Fair warning, Dad's in rare form tonight. Last chance to come to your senses. I closed the journal, made copies of the key documents from Patricia's USB drive, and prepared for what would likely be the most important dinner of my life. The Wexler dining room had always been a battleground disguised as civility. Carrara marble, crystal chandeliers, and silver serving pieces creating the perfect backdrop for psychological warfare. Tonight was no exception. My father sat at the head of the table, Julian to his right, my mother to his left. The empty chair beside Julian awaited me, physically and symbolically positioned as the lesser son. You're late, my father observed as Rivera, their longtime butler, took my coat. Traffic, I replied, taking my assigned seat. Thank you for agreeing to meet. My mother signaled Rivera, who began serving the first course, butternut squash soup that no one touched. We've considered your proposal, my father began without preamble. We're prepared to maintain family appearances under certain conditions. Julian slid a document across the table, a typed agreement with signature lines at the bottom. It's all there. We acknowledge you as CEO publicly. You retain financial control, but operational decisions require consensus from a newly formed executive committee. I scanned the document, noting the carefully worded clauses that would effectively neuter my authority while preserving the appearance of honoring my grandfather's will. And this executive committee would consist of Dad, myself, and you, Julian answered smoothly. Majority rule on all strategic decisions. So I'd be CEO in name only, I translated. You'd be part of a leadership team, my father corrected, one that leverages everyone's strengths. Julian's business acumen, my experience, He paused, searching for a diplomatic term. Fresh perspective. I set the document down. And if I refuse? My father's expression hardened. Then tomorrow's board meeting becomes very uncomfortable for everyone. I've spent 30 years building relationships with those board members, Caleb. They trust me, not you. We're offering you dignity, my mother added, finally breaking her silence. A chance to save face while acknowledging reality. I looked around the table at the family that had dismissed me for decades, now offering me crumbs from what was legally mine and calling it generosity. Before I answer, I said carefully, I'd like to ask about Meridian Capital. The subtle shift in my father's expression confirmed everything. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, his fingers tightening around his water glass. What about them? He asked, his tone deliberately casual. Just curious about your private meetings with Lawrence Chen, the ones you kept off your official calendar. Julian looked confused, but my father maintained his composure. We've had preliminary discussions with several potential partners. Nothing concrete. I withdrew copies of the documents Patricia had provided, sliding them across the polished table surface. These look fairly concrete to me. The color drained from my father's face as he recognized the papers. My mother leaned forward, concern replacing her usual detachment. Julian reached for the documents, scanning them with growing alarm. Dad, what is this? He demanded. You were planning to sell controlling interest to Meridian? Without telling me? Not sell, my father snapped. Strategic partnership. And it's a complex negotiation you wouldn't understand. I understand enough, Julian shot back. According to this, I'd be regional president of North American operations, effectively. A middle manager reporting to Singapore. That's not what you promised me. The fracture between them was instantaneous and revelatory. Julian wasn't upset about the ethical breach or potential illegality. He was upset about his diminished role in the arrangement. You were never going to give Julian control, were you? I asked my father quietly. Even before Grandpa's will, you were already arranging to cash out your shares to Meridian while creating a golden parachute for yourself. My father's expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. You have no idea what it takes to safeguard a company like this. Martin built something remarkable. But times change. Markets evolve. Sometimes survival requires difficult choices. Selling out the company my grandfather built to foreign investors isn't a difficult choice. It's betrayal, I countered. And using your position to orchestrate it secretly is fraud. Don't be dramatic, he scoffed, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. This is business, not some morality play. I stood, gathering the documents. Tomorrow's board meeting is going to be different than you planned, Dad. I've invoked the emergency succession protocol under Section 11.3 of the bylaws. Henderson filed the paperwork this afternoon. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. You can't do that. I already have. As controlling shareholder, I've removed you as chairman effective immediately, pending board ratification. Julian remains in his position for now, provided he votes his shares. Independently tomorrow. Julian stared at me, then at our father, clearly calculating his best move in this unexpected scenario. This company is my life's work, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet. No, I corrected him. It's Grandpa's life's work, and he entrusted it to me, not because I was the perfect heir, but because he knew I would protect what matters. The people who work there, the principles it was founded on, the integrity of what he built. My mother reached for my father's arm. Samuel, what exactly is in those papers? How bad is this? He shrugged her off, his attention fixed on me. You think you've won something here? You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, I replied, surprised by my own calm. I've honored my grandfather's trust. The question is what you're going to do now. I left without waiting for an answer, walking out of the house that had never truly been my home, into a future that was uncertain, but finally, indisputably, mine. The boardroom the next morning hummed with tension. Board members clustered in small groups, whispering behind hands and coffee cups, conversations ceasing whenever I approached. Henderson and his associates had arrived early, setting up at one end of the massive table, legal documents arranged in precise stacks before them. Patricia caught my eye as she entered, her professional mask firmly in place, though she gave me the barest nod of acknowledgement. Behind her came Julian, alone and uncharacteristically subdued. Where's Dad? I asked as he took a seat near the middle of the table, neither aligned with me nor opposed. Not coming, Julian replied flatly. Said there's no point. Before I could press further, Henderson called the meeting to order. The formalities proceeded with an air of brittle politeness. Minutes approved, agenda reviewed, the strange absence of the former chairman noted but not explained. As you're all aware, Henderson began, yesterday afternoon, Caleb Wexler, as controlling shareholder of Wexler Industries, invoked Section 11.3 of the company bylaws, removing Samuel Wexler from his position as chairman, effective immediately but subject to ratification by this board. The murmuring intensified. Richard Hargrove, the silver-haired board member who had questioned me at my first meeting, leaned forward. On what grounds? I nodded to Henderson, who distributed copies of the key documents from Patricia's USB drive, redacted to protect her identity, but with my father's signature and initials clearly visible. These materials evidence Mr. Samuel Wexler's undisclosed negotiations with Meridian Capital, a foreign-controlled investment firm, Henderson explained, his tone matter of fact. The proposed transaction would have effectively transferred control of Wexler Industries' proprietary technology and manufacturing capabilities outside U.S. jurisdiction, without board knowledge or approval. The room erupted in exclamations and questions. Hargrove flipped through the pages with increasing alarm. Other board members huddled over shared copies, pointing at particular clauses. Is this verified? Hargrove demanded. These are serious allegations. My firm has authenticated the documents, Henderson confirmed. Additionally, we've identified financial transfers from Meridian subsidiaries to offshore accounts linked to Mr. Wexler. The SEC has been notified as a precautionary measure, though no formal investigation has been launched. Julian's head snapped up. You reported Dad to the SEC? We fulfilled our legal obligation to disclose potential securities violations, I clarified. What happens next depends largely on how transparently we handle this internally. The message was clear. This could be contained if the board acted decisively. The alternative was a public scandal, regulatory scrutiny, and significant damage to the company. Hargrove looked at me with new respect. What are you proposing? Mr. Wexler? A clean break, I replied. The board ratifies my father's removal and accepts his immediate resignation from all company positions. In exchange, we characterize his departure as a planned retirement, keep these documents confidential, and move forward under new leadership. And if we don't ratify? Another board member asked. Then we have no choice but to publicly disclose the reasons for his termination, Henderson answered. The legal and reputational consequences would be significant. The vote, when it came, was unanimous, including Julian's reluctant affirmation. My father's 30-year reign at Wexler Industries ended not with the dramatic confrontation he'd likely expected, but with a procedural voice vote in a boardroom he'd chosen not to attend. There's one additional matter, I said as Henderson gathered his materials. I'm appointing Julian Wexler as President of International Operations, effective immediately. Julian's head jerked up in surprise. The board members exchanged glances. He retains his seat on this board and full voting rights with his shares, I continued. His compensation package remains unchanged. His primary responsibility will be overseeing our European expansion from our London office. Understanding dawned on Julian's face. I wasn't firing him. I was exiling him, giving him a prestigious title and significant responsibility, but removing him from the Miami headquarters where he could undermine me. All in favor? Henderson asked. The ayes were again unanimous, though Julian abstained, his expression unreadable. As the meeting adjourned, board members approached to shake my hand, some warmly, others warily, all with a new acknowledgement in their eyes. I wasn't just Martin Wexler's grandson anymore. I wasn't the overlooked second son. I was the CEO who had navigated a potential crisis with decisive action and minimal collateral damage. Julian remained in his seat as the room emptied, waiting until we were alone, before speaking. London, he said finally. That's diplomatic. It's a good opportunity, I replied. The European market has been underserved. You'll have autonomy to build something significant there. He studied me with unfamiliar uncertainty. Why not fire me outright, after everything? I considered the question carefully. Because we're still brothers. Because you're still valuable to this company. And because I'm not Dad. I don't need to destroy you to succeed. Something shifted in Julian's expression. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that I wasn't who he'd always assumed I was. I didn't know about Meridian, he said quietly. I would never have agreed to that structure. I know. He stood straightening his tie with a habitual gesture. I'll need 2 weeks to get my affairs in order before relocating. Take a month, I offered. The London office could use some renovation before you arrive. I'll have Patricia coordinate the details. Julian nodded, then extended his hand, a businesslike gesture that nonetheless represented the first time he'd treated me as an equal. I shook it, recognizing it for the armistice it was. After he left, I remained, at the boardroom table, running my hands over its polished surface, the same table where my grandfather had presided for decades, where my father had plotted his ill-fated deals, where I had now established my own authority. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Your father is leaving for the Bahamas tonight. Indefinitely. Will you see him before he goes? I stared at the message, considering my answer. There was no real reconciliation possible. Too many years of dismissal. Too many wounds inflicted with casual cruelty. But perhaps there could be closure. I'll stop by at 5, I replied. My father was packing when I arrived, methodically filling a leather suitcase with the precise, controlled movements that had characterized his entire life. He didn't look up when I entered his study. Come to gloat? He asked, folding a dress shirt with military corners. No, I said, remaining by the door. I came to return this. I placed my grandfather's journal on his desk. My father paused, looking at it with an unreadable expression. I've read what I needed to, I continued. The rest of it belongs to the family archive. He closed the suitcase before turning to face me. In the late afternoon light, he looked older, diminished somehow, though his posture remained rigidly proud. You outplayed me, he acknowledged, not quite managing to keep the bitterness from his voice. Martin would have been impressed. This wasn't a game, I said. It was never about winning. Then what was it about? I thought about all the possible answers. Justice, revenge, validation, but settled on the simplest truth. It was about becoming the person Grandpa knew I could be. The person you never saw. My father's jaw tightened. I saw you, Caleb. I just saw someone different than Martin did. He moved to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. I saw someone too gentle for the business world, too thoughtful, too. He searched for the word principled. You saw weakness? I translated. I saw vulnerability, he corrected. And in my experience, this world devours the vulnerable. For the first time, I glimpsed something beyond my father's constant disappointment, a twisted form of protection, a belief that his criticism was preparing me for a harsh reality. I'm not as vulnerable as you think, I said quietly. And principles aren't weakness. They're what built Wexler Industries in the first place. He turned back to me, his expression softening fractionally. Perhaps, or perhaps Martin just caught the right economic wave with the right product at the right time. You really believe that? That his success was just luck and timing? My father shrugged. I believe business is unsentimental. Principles are a luxury for those who can afford them. And, selling out to Meridian? What principle was that? A flash of the old anger crossed his face. That was survival. American manufacturing is dying. Tariffs, regulations, labor costs. The future belongs to global entities, not patriotic holdouts. That's not what Wexler Industries stands for. No, he agreed unexpectedly. It's not. Which is why Martin chose you, not me or Julian. He saw the world, changing and decided Wexler should hold on to the past. I shook my head. Not the past. The foundation. There's a difference. My father studied me for a long moment, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. You really are his grandson, aren't you? I never saw it before. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even exactly a compliment, but it was perhaps the closest thing to validation I would ever receive from Samuel Wexler. The board accepted your retirement announcement, I said, changing the subject. There won't be any public disclosure of the Meridian documents as long as you honor the separation agreement Henderson drafted. Relief crossed his face briefly before his mask of indifference returned. Generous of you. It's not generosity. It's protecting the company from unnecessary scandal. He nodded, accepting the correction. And Julian? London. International operations. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Exile with a promotion. Clever. He'll do well there, I said. Away from your shadow. Away from mine. My father picked up the journal, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. He never let me read this, you know. His precious journal. Always. Said it was private. It was, I agreed. But he knew someday someone would need to understand how he built what he built, why he made the choices he made. And now you do. Now I do. We looked at each other across the study. Father and son, former CEO and current one, strangers who shared blood but had never truly known each other. I should finish packing, he said finally. I nodded, recognizing the dismissal. At the door, I paused. When does your flight leave? 8:30, he replied. Your mother's coming for a few weeks, then we'll see. I hesitated, then offered the closest thing to an olive branch I could manage. I'll have the company plane prepared. It's still yours to use. Retirement perks. Surprise registered briefly on his face, followed by a curt nod. The closest thing to gratitude Samuel Wexler could express. As I left the house that had never truly been my home, I felt not triumph, but a quieter, more profound emotion. The peace of finally standing in my own truth, neither defined by their dismissal nor consumed by the need to prove them wrong. My grandfather's final entry in his journal came back to me as I drove away from the estate. The true measure of a man isn't what he inherits, but what he builds with his own hands. Caleb will understand this someday. He already builds in ways Samuel and Julian cannot see, with compassion, with integrity, with a vision beyond profit margins. When the time comes, he will transform what I created into something I could only imagine. And he will do it not because he bears my name, but because he carries my values in a heart that is entirely his own. The Miami sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and gold as I drove toward the future. Not the one they had dismissed me from, but the one my grandfather had always seen waiting for me, hidden in plain sight all along.